My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 82 years old. I have lived a long life in a small town just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I raised 2 children, a boy and a girl, all by myself after their father passed when they were young. I worked double shifts at the diner, packed school lunches, stitched their clothes late into the night, and prayed every day that they would grow up knowing the value of love and family. But love, it seems, is not something you can force someone to return. For the past 10 years, my birthday has come and gone like an unmarked grave. No phone calls. No flowers. Not even a text message from the very children I sacrificed everything for. They grew up, married, moved into big houses, and never looked back. I sat alone year after year with a single cupcake and a candle, whispering my own birthday wishes into an empty kitchen. But this year was different. I had turned 82 that morning. I sat in my quiet house, looking at the framed pictures of their childhoods on the wall, and something inside me cracked. I realized that I wasn't invisible by accident. I was invisible by their choice. And so, I made a decision. A wicked, brilliant decision. I would plan my own funeral. A grand one, with flowers, music, and a casket. But here's the twist, I wouldn't invite them. Not my son, not my daughter, not even their spouses. Let them wonder. Let them hear whispers in town that their mother had died without them. Let them feel the shame of strangers' pity. I wanted them to know the sting of being forgotten. That night, I took out an old notebook from the drawer, the same one I used to write their childhood doctor appointments in, and on the first page, I wrote in big letters, my funeral plans. And as I pressed my pen against the paper, I smiled for the first time in years. Because this time, I wasn't the one being left behind. When I close my eyes, I can still see them as children. Michael with his messy brown hair and scraped knees, always climbing trees he had no business climbing, and Laura, my little shadow, clinging to my apron strings with her big green eyes that always searched for my approval. Back then, I thought love was enough to hold a family together. When their father, Richard, died in that terrible car accident, I was only 41 years old. I remember the night the sheriff knocked on my door, hat in hand, saying words that shattered my world. But I couldn't fall apart. Not with 2 children looking up at me. So, I put on my waitress uniform the very next morning, tied my hair in a bun, and went to work. Every penny mattered. I skipped meals so they could eat. I wore thrift store shoes so they could have new sneakers for school. I stood on my aching feet for 14-hour shifts at the diner, smiling at strangers while my heart broke inside. And yet, I never complained. I thought the reward for sacrifice was loyalty. I believed that if I gave them everything, they would always come back home. I remember Laura's high school graduation. She walked across the stage in her blue cap and gown, her hair shining under the lights. I clapped until my hands stung, tears rolling down my face. That night, as we ate cake in our small kitchen, she hugged me tight and whispered, "Mom, one day I'll take care of you the way you took care of us." Those words carried me for years. But words are like smoke, they disappear before you realize they were never solid to begin with. Because years later, when I was the one who needed care, when my knees grew weak and my hands shook too much to thread a needle, there was no one by my side. My phone stayed silent. My front porch empty. The girl who promised to care for me was nowhere to be found. And the boy who once cried for me when he scraped his knee now wouldn't even cry for me on my birthday. That's when it hit me. I hadn't raised children. I had raised strangers. And now, those strangers were about to discover that the mother they had abandoned was not as weak and forgotten as they believed. Because my funeral plans weren't just plans. They were revenge. The next morning, I woke up with a new kind of energy buzzing through my bones. At 82, my joints usually screamed when I climbed out of bed, but that day, my spirit carried me. I felt alive. I dressed in my Sunday best, a navy blue dress I hadn't worn since church stopped being part of my life, and I went into town. Everyone in Maplewood, our little Tennessee town, knew me as Maggie from the diner. Even though I retired years ago, people still waved when they saw me. That was the one thing about small towns. You can disappear to your family, but never to your neighbors. At the florist shop, I picked out lilies, my favorite flowers. For a special occasion, the young clerk asked. I smiled and said, yes, for something very special. Next, I stopped at Henderson and Sons Funeral Home. The director, Mr. Henderson, had known me for decades. His father buried Richard all those years ago. When I walked in, he looked surprised but kind. Maggie, what brings you here? He asked gently. I looked him straight in the eyes and said, I want to plan my own funeral. His brows furrowed. Well, of course, that's a responsible thing to do. For your children, to save them the burden. Not for them, I interrupted. My voice was steady. This is for me. He studied me for a moment, then nodded, as if he understood more than I had said. We sat in his office, and I chose everything with precision. The casket, a modest pinewood one, nothing fancy. The hymns, I picked Amazing Grace because I knew it would make Laura cry if she ever heard it. The flowers, white lilies mixed with roses. But here's where it got delicious. The guest list. I told Mr. Henderson plainly, no family, only my friends from town. The people who remembered me when my own blood did not. He hesitated, then wrote it down. When I walked out of that funeral home, clutching the folder with all the plans, I felt taller. Stronger. For once in my life, I was the one writing the story, not waiting for someone else to include me in theirs. But even as I smiled, a thought tugged at me. What would happen when Michael and Laura found out too late? Would they cry? Would they even care? And that's when a darker idea slipped into my mind, an idea that made me both nervous and excited. Maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't stay gone. The days after I left the funeral home felt like I was living a double life. To my neighbors, I was the same old Maggie, buying groceries at the corner store, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, waving at passing cars. But inside, I was spinning a secret so bold that even I could hardly believe it. I wasn't just planning a funeral. I was planning to vanish. One evening, I pulled out the old cedar chest from under my bed. Inside were pieces of my past, Richard's wedding ring, faded love letters, and a photo album with cracked leather edges. But I wasn't searching for memories. I was searching for something practical. Hidden beneath the quilt my mama stitched was a small envelope stuffed with cash. I'd been saving it for years, just in case. Now I finally knew what the case was. With that money, I bought a burner phone at the gas station and rented a small storage unit on the edge of town. I started moving little things there, an extra pair of shoes, a blanket, canned food, even my Bible. Slowly, carefully, I built myself a hideaway where no one would think to look. Meanwhile, I spread whispers. At church, I told Mrs. Thompson I'd been feeling weaker these days. At the pharmacy, I asked the young clerk if he thought my heart pills seemed stronger than before. At the post office, I sighed loud enough for folks to hear me say, some days I feel like I won't be around much longer. I knew Maplewood well enough to understand that rumors traveled faster than truth. By the time the week was over, people were already giving me sympathetic looks, patting my hand, asking if I needed anything. Good. Let them think I was fading. And then, on a stormy Friday night, I put the final piece into place. I called Mr. Henderson at the funeral home from my burner phone. It's time, I told him, my voice soft but steady. Schedule it for 2 weeks from today. There was silence on the line before he replied, Are you sure, Maggie? Yes, I said firmly. But remember, my children are not to be told. When I hung up, thunder cracked outside, rattling the windows. I looked at my reflection in the glass and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes weren't tired anymore. They were sharp, alive, even dangerous. For the first time in decades, I wasn't the victim of someone else's choices. This time, I was the one pulling the strings. But deep in my chest, one question clawed at me, when the day of the funeral came and Michael and Laura realized they hadn't been invited. Would it hurt them? Or would they feel nothing at all? 2 weeks before my funeral, I sat in my little kitchen, sipping lukewarm tea, and thought about Michael and Laura. I hadn't heard from either of them in months, but I knew enough through neighbors and whispers in town. Michael lived just 30 miles away in Franklin, Tennessee, in a shiny new subdivision with his wife, Karen, and their 2 spoiled teenagers. He worked in real estate now, driving around in a gleaming black SUV while selling houses bigger than any I could have dreamed of. People said he bragged about how he came from nothing. He never mentioned me, the woman who worked her fingers raw so he could go to college. The last time I called him, it was because the pipes in my bathroom had burst. I begged him to stop by or send someone. His answer still echoed in my ears. "Mom, I'm busy. Just call a plumber. Don't guilt-trip me every time something goes wrong." As if I were some burden he carried on his back, instead of the reason he could stand tall at all. And Laura, my sweet girl, my shadow. She had moved all the way to Atlanta, Georgia, chasing a corporate career. At first, she called every week, then every month, then, not at all. She had married a man named Robert, tall, handsome, with a wallet full of promises. But I saw through him from the start. He didn't like me. Said I lived too simple, said I held Laura back. The last Thanksgiving she came to visit, 5 years ago, he refused to eat my homemade cornbread. He told Laura later, when he thought I couldn't hear, "This place smells like old people. Don't bring me back here again." She never did. When I sent her a letter last year, begging her to come for my birthday, she replied with one sentence on a cold email. "Mom, I'm too busy, maybe next year." Next year came. She never showed. I thought about those nights when Laura was a little girl, crying because she had nightmares. I would crawl into her bed, stroke her hair, and whisper, "Don't worry, Mommy's here. Mommy will never leave you." But she left me. They both did. And now, as they sipped wine in their perfect homes, laughing with their perfect friends, they had no idea that their forgotten mother was about to vanish from their lives in a way they couldn't ignore. Because when the news spread that Margaret Collins had passed away, they wouldn't be on the guest list. And the whole town would know it. The first whisper came from the church bulletin. I knew it would. In Maplewood, no one dies quietly. The pastor had seen me talking to Mr. Henderson, and by the next Sunday, a single line appeared under announcements. "Please keep Margaret Collins in your prayers as she prepares for her journey home." It didn't say funeral. It didn't say death. But people knew what it meant. Old women pressed tissues to their lips. Men tipped their hats when they saw me, saying things like, "You'll be with Richard soon." I played my part beautifully, smiling weakly, nodding, lowering my eyes like someone fading from the world. Inside, though, I was alive with fire. By Wednesday, the whispers had reached Michael. A neighbor called to check on him. "I heard your mama's not doing well," they said. He pretended to sound concerned, but I knew my boy. He probably just sighed, annoyed at the thought of driving down to Maplewood. Laura, too, must have heard. One of her old classmates from town posted on Facebook, "Prayers for Margaret Collins. A true angel." People tagged her in the comments. She didn't reply. She never does. Still, I could imagine her at her desk in Atlanta, staring at the screen with that guilty pinch in her brow. Would she feel something? Anything? Or would she click away, pretending it wasn't about her? Meanwhile, my real friends, the ones who checked in on me, the ones who remembered birthdays and brought pies on Christmas, helped Mr. Henderson prepare. They brought casseroles, knitted blankets, even offered to sing at the service. My little house filled with kindness, the kind my own children had long forgotten to show. And that's when I realized something sharp and painful. Maybe I didn't even want Michael or Laura at my funeral. Maybe this wasn't revenge at all. Maybe this was freedom. But freedom comes with a price. Because if they truly didn't show, if they truly didn't care, then the final nail wouldn't be in my coffin, it would be in my heart. And so, I waited. For the day the world thought I died. For the moment when my children would have to face the truth. But what I didn't know then was that my plan wouldn't just expose their neglect. It would uncover a secret I was never meant to find. The morning of my funeral dawned grey and heavy, as though the sky itself had agreed to mourn me. I dressed carefully, not in black, but in a plain cardigan and slacks. Nothing about me looked like the woman they were burying that day. That was the beauty of it. I could walk the streets as a ghost in plain sight. From the hill overlooking Henderson and Son's funeral home, I watched as people trickled in. My friends filled the chapel, Mrs. Thompson with her cane, the Jenkins family carrying a pot of lilies, even old Mr. Carter who could barely walk anymore. They came because they remembered me. They came because I mattered to them. But Michael and Laura? Not a trace. Part of me felt a stab of relief. They hadn't been invited, and it looked like they hadn't dared to show their faces. Another part of me, a softer, foolish part, ached at their absence. I had hoped, deep down, that maybe they would fight their way inside, demand to be part of my last goodbye. But no. Silence. The service began. I slipped into the back of the chapel, unnoticed, hiding behind a veil hat I found in my cedar chest. It was surreal, listening to my own eulogy. Mrs. Thompson spoke first, her voice trembling. Maggie was the kind of woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. She was family to all of us. Family. The word burned. Mr. Henderson read from the Bible, his voice solemn. Well done, good and faithful servant. I almost laughed. Faithful. Yes. But good. I wasn't so sure anymore. Then came the moment that shattered my composure. A tall stranger stood up. Someone I didn't recognize. He placed a single white rose on the closed casket and whispered, "Thank you, Margaret. You saved me when no one else cared." I frowned. Saved him. Who was he? Murmurs rippled through the chapel, but no one explained. I tried to study his face, but he slipped out the back door before I could follow. My hands shook. For years I believed my story was one of abandonment, of giving everything for nothing in return. But here was a man claiming I had saved him, someone I didn't even remember. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I thought I was the one controlling this funeral. But perhaps, the dead weren't the only ones with secrets. After the service ended, I lingered in the back of the chapel as people hugged, wiped their tears, and carried casseroles to the tables in the fellowship hall. Everyone was grieving me, and yet there I was, alive, trembling, more unsettled than I'd ever been. But my eyes weren't on the mourners. They were on the door where that stranger had slipped away. Who was he? And what did he mean when he said I'd saved him? That night, when I returned to my little house, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen with the rose he had placed on my casket. I had snatched it before anyone noticed. Its petals were soft, fresh, alive, unlike the brittle photographs of my family that hung on the walls. I thought back through the years, searching my memory. I had served hundreds, no, thousands, of people at the diner. I had poured coffee, listened to stories, lent an ear to strangers passing through. Could he have been one of them? A broken man I once offered a meal or kind word to. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Because if I had touched his life so deeply that he came to mourn me, then maybe my children weren't the only ones who had been watching me all these years. The next morning, I went back into town. At the diner, now run by a young couple, I asked around, described the man. No one knew him. At the post office, the same. At the grocery store, nothing. But then, at the gas station, old Mr. Carter's grandson piped up. "Oh, I saw him talking to Michael last week. Tall guy, kind of quiet. Drove a silver truck." My stomach dropped. Michael. Why on earth would this stranger, this man who brought a rose to my funeral, be meeting with my son? And then another thought hit me like a hammer. What if this wasn't about gratitude? What if it was about money? I had left everything I owned, my house, my savings, even Richard's old life insurance policy, in Michael and Laura's names. They didn't know it yet. But if someone else did? I gripped the rose so tightly its thorns pierced my skin. Maybe I wasn't the only one planning something behind closed doors. Maybe my children weren't just neglectful. Maybe they were hiding something far darker. For days, the question clawed at me. Why was that stranger meeting with Michael? I knew my son too well. Michael was greedy, always chasing the next big sale, the next promotion, the next dollar. I had excused it once as ambition. But ambition doesn't explain why a mysterious man brought a rose to my funeral and whispered words that only I could hear. So, one evening, I did something I never imagined at 82 years old. I followed my own son. I borrowed Mrs. Thompson's beat-up Ford, parked it a block away from Michael's real estate office, and waited. Hours passed. Then, just as the sun dipped low, I saw him step out with the stranger. Tall, broad-shouldered, with that same silver truck parked at the curb. They didn't notice me as they walked toward the truck, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments. The house deed. Once it's in my name. She won't know a thing. My blood ran cold. They weren't talking about some business deal. They were talking about me. About my home. The stranger pulled out a folder, handed it to Michael, and Michael grinned, as though he hadn't already buried me in his heart years ago. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My own son was plotting to steal the only thing I had left, the house Richard and I built, the house where I raised them, the house where every sacrifice of my life lived within its walls. And Laura. Later that night, when I searched her name online at the library, I found her, too, tied into the mess. A business filing, her signature scrawled next to Michael's, both of them linked to some LLC I'd never heard of. My children weren't just neglecting me. They were preparing to erase me, alive or dead. I sat there in the glow of that library computer, my hands trembling, my heart thundering against my ribs. The funeral I had planned was supposed to teach them guilt, to make them feel the pain of absence. But now, it wasn't enough. They didn't just forget me. They were profiting from me. And for that, there would be no forgiveness. Not in this life. The night before my funeral reception, I sat at my kitchen table with the rose the stranger had left on my casket. Its petals had begun to wilt, curling at the edges, but it still held its beauty. Much like me, weathered, but not gone. I had a choice to make. I could vanish quietly, let Michael and Laura steal my home, my savings, and my memory. Or I could rise from the grave I dug for myself and drag their sins into the light. I chose the latter. When the day came, the fellowship hall at the church was full. My neighbors gathered with casseroles and kind smiles, talking about dear Margaret as though I were already gone. Michael and Laura finally appeared, late, rushing in with wide eyes and false tears. Word had reached them that their mother was gone, and they couldn't resist showing up for the inheritance parade. I waited until Mr. Henderson stood at the podium, thanking everyone for coming. And then, from the back of the hall, I stepped forward. Gasps filled the room. Forks clattered onto plates. Mrs. Thompson dropped her cane. Michael's face drained of color. Laura swayed on her heels as though she'd seen an actual ghost. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "It's me. Alive. Very much alive." The silence broke into whispers. Some cried, some laughed nervously, some looked at my children with disgust. I walked straight to the podium, every eye in that room burning into me. I laid the wilted rose on the table and stared at Michael and Laura. "You forgot my birthday for 10 years, I said. "You left me alone. But I could have forgiven that. What I cannot forgive is this." From my cardigan pocket, I pulled out the documents I had copied from the library. Proof of the LLC, their signatures, the attempt to steal my home. I held them high for all to see. Gasps turned into outrage. Neighbors shook their heads. Someone muttered, "Shameful." Michael tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Mom, it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like," I snapped. My voice didn't tremble. For the first time in years, I sounded like the mother who once stood tall, protecting her children from the world. Only now, I was protecting myself, from them. "You will not take my house," I continued. "You will not take my name. And when I die for real, everything I have will go to the people who remembered me, who loved me, who showed up when you did not." I turned to the crowd, to the neighbors who fed me when I was sick, who remembered my birthdays when my own blood did not. "You are my family now." Tears ran down Mrs. Thompson's cheeks. The room erupted in applause, not for my pain, but for my defiance. Michael and Laura stood frozen, their reputations crumbling before the very people they once sought to impress. And in that moment, I felt no regret. Because I hadn't just faked my funeral. I had buried the last shred of power my children ever had over me. And in doing so, I was finally free.